Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Wendy Edelberg, Director of the Hamilton Project at Brookings. We're delighted to be hosting this discussion with the Peterson Institute for International Economics on a topic that has taken center stage in this presidential election. And that topic is tariffs and their potential impact on the U.S. economy. In the last decade, tariffs have gained ground in both parties. In the first Trump administration, we saw tariffs imposed on China, which the Biden-Harris administration has mostly kept in place and in some cases expanded. Now, former President Trump is promising a 60% tariff on goods from China and double-digit tariffs on everything else the U.S. imports. To some degree, surely targeted tariffs are a part of the usual policy toolkit, but very high across-the-board tariffs are another thing entirely. They can have far-reaching effects on everything from inflation to supply chains to the labor market to interest rates. Today, we aim to explore those potential economic impacts of double-digit across-the-board tariffs. I am delighted to be joined by our friends from Peterson. Jason Furman, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and Maurice Obstfeld, former chief economist at the IMF. And we're fortunate to have Anna Swanson, who covers trade for the New York Times, to moderate the conversation. If you have questions, please email them to info@hamiltonproject.org or tweet them with the hashtag tariffs. And now I will happily turn it over to Anna.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you for having me and for inviting me to moderate this discussion today. So tariffs are back in the news again. I'm sure you're all feeling a bit of deja vu about it recently, as I have been. Very big topic in the 2024 election. Wendy has already given a nice introduction to some of the proposed policies that the panelists will be discussing today. The variety of very significant tariffs that President Trump has proposed placing on foreign exports. Wendy and Maurice also put out a piece this week examining the implications of some of those proposed tariffs and, as she said, found wide-ranging consequences on businesses, consumers, and trade relationships. So let me go right to the panelists and open it up for questions. Maurice, let's start with you. Could you give us an overview of the effects that across-the-board tariffs might have? Thanks.
Well, I think it's important, first of all, to understand the magnitude of what Donald Trump is proposing. The tariffs he levied in his first administration covered somewhere around $380 billion worth of imported goods. What he's contemplating now are tariffs that would cover 8 to 9 times that level of imported activity. And these would represent a huge shock to households and businesses. Contrary to the arguments Donald Trump has made, most recently at the Economic Club of Chicago, tariffs are not a tax on foreigners. They are a tax paid by U.S. households and businesses. Consumers face higher prices. Businesses face higher prices for intermediate goods that they rely on to produce their products, and they can either eat the hit to their profits or they can pass on the prices to consumers. Moreover, tariffs are a regressive tax. They're more likely to be passed on by companies that have slim profit margins and that produce goods that are somewhat less expensive that poorer households rely on. Poorer households probably consume more of the imported goods. They're contractionary because they raise costs for businesses. And in terms of the extent of the tariffs, people often refer to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930. These cover much more than the Smoot-Hawley tariffs did. I mean, this is a bigger shock to the U.S. economy. So If these are implemented, the economy's in for a pretty wild ride.
Wendy, could you elaborate also on what are some of the near-term effects you think these kinds of tariffs might have?
I think there's been a lot of really excellent research that has, reflected what we already knew and done some more empirical estimation to show that tariffs of this magnitude would increase inflation overall, probably over the next couple of years, would have negative employment effects, would be bad for the overall economy. But what I felt, and in the piece that I wrote with Maurice, what I thought wasn't getting enough attention was the very near-term chaos that would result from the imposition of these sorts of very, very significant and wide-ranging tariffs. And to think about what might happen, Maurice and I looked at the episodes in the first Trump administration. And for example, the Federal Reserve put out a beige book in November 2019 that collects lots and lots of anecdotal information from businesses and community leaders, civic leaders all across the country. So perhaps it's enough anecdotes that it reaches the level of being data. And in that 30-page report, in that 25-page report, tariffs were mentioned 30 times in November of 2019. So businesses were worried about supply chain disruptions. They were worried about tariff-related cost increases. And they were worried about stock building as a hedge against future tariffs. And in fact, we see this most assuredly in the data. So like in the first wave of the tariffs that Trump imposed in 2018, for the goods that were affected by those tariffs, one empirical study showed a 40% increase in the amount of imports of those goods right before the tariff was imposed. And so I want everyone to imagine these sorts of very significant tariffs being imposed on all goods we import, and those kinds of chaotic responses by businesses as they try to renegotiate contracts, as they try, if they can, to force their international suppliers to absorb some of the cost of the tariffs and lower the prices that the US importers are facing. And also this significant amount of hoarding that we can expect, not when the tariffs are actually imposed, but as soon as, perhaps if Trump is elected and he seems to be committed to this, perhaps in December, we will start seeing companies respond as fast as they can to try to get ahead of these tariffs. What we're going to see is some warehouses are going to be gorged with goods and some warehouses are going to be empty. And that's going to be passed along to consumers, to businesses, not just businesses that sell goods, but businesses that actually sell services, but remarkably need imported goods to actually make those services go. And so we're going to see this significant chaos across the entire business landscape.
And let's go to Jason. So Wendy did touch on inflation in her comments. We also had an audience question come in before the event asking, how would tariff plans from both Trump and Harris impact inflation over the next 5 years? Could you talk a bit about that? And then how would you expect monetary policymakers to respond as well?
Yeah, so it's great to be here with you and Maurice and Wendy. The first thing to understand is monetary policymakers cannot fix the problems that this will cause. Monetary policymakers basically take structural policies as given. And if you do a structural policy like this, you are hurting the economy in all sorts of ways that they can't solve. In particular, this one is especially hard for them to solve because it will have effects going in two directions. One, as Wendy mentioned, and as the question mentioned, is inflation will rise. And that will be spread out over some period of time because not every good will they run out and change the price in the supermarket or wherever else. Some of them they will, by the way, right away. Some of them may take some time depending on renegotiations or what they were priced in. But over some period of time, prices will rise. There's some question as to how long the inflation would last. If it changes inflation expectations, or price increases lead to faster wage increases, and faster wage increases lead to faster price increases, you can get some additional persistence from all of this. So on the one hand, the Fed is going to be quite worried about this inflation. But at the same time, it's also going to cost jobs, put upward pressure on the unemployment rate, and raise the risk of a recession. And so the Fed's going to want to raise rates in order to combat the inflation. It's going to want to lower rates in order to prevent a risk of a recession. And it's going to be doing all of this in a climate where financial conditions will, absent any action by the Fed, already have tightened through a combination of a stronger dollar, a falling stock market, and rising risk premia. Overall, how they sort through that complicated mixture, my guess would be with higher interest rates. My guess is they will think the most important thing for them to do is to combat the inflation and make sure this does not get embedded in inflation expectations and lead to a long-term rise in the inflation rate. But if they do that, they'll be raising the risk of a recession. And conversely, if they try to minimize the risk of recession, they'll dramatically raise the risk that this is not just a temporary, but a permanent increase in inflation. So there's no good answer for the Fed. Probably it'll be higher rates with a big trade-off involved in that choice.
So I'll ask a few questions. I'd just like to open it up for discussion if you want to jump in or respond to each other. So the main Trump campaign argument is that tariffs help the economy by promoting domestic manufacturing. So, and in fact, I think you do see instances in economic literature where tariffs do spur domestic manufacturing, right? So in your view, are these just kind of outweighed by higher costs to consumers or importers? Can you talk a bit about what would happen to domestic manufacturing?
Yeah, could I jump in on that? There's been a lot of research on that, given that we have a controlled experiment in a sense of the Trump tariffs and how that affected manufacturing, and the results are not positive. Now, I should say as background that manufacturing has been declining in the U.S. for years, for decades. It declines in all industrial countries. It's been declining in China since 2013, and China actually never reached the peak of manufacturing employment as a percentage of the non-farm labor force that we did in the United States. And this is due to the increasing productivity of workers in manufacturing, which effectively releases them to go into the service sector. So there's a trend, and all the studies we have indicate that trade liberalization may be part of that, but it's far from the majority of the forces that have led to lower manufacturing employment. So the idea that you can, through trade policy, reverse this big decline in manufacturing is very misguided. Now, what about the specific evidence of the Trump tariffs? There have been a couple of high-quality studies which indicated that they did not save any manufacturing jobs and probably lost manufacturing jobs on net. You can think of the tariffs as having three effects. One is to shield some businesses from import competition, allowing them to supply more goods to the domestic market and to hire more workers. That's a positive effect on manufacturing employment, and that's the one that the proponents of tariffs point to. But there are also the negative effects of higher input costs, which lead these firms to contract. As Jason said, this is a contractionary impact, which leads to lower manufacturing employment. There's also the effect of retaliation, which we haven't talked about yet, but there was retaliation last time. There will be massive retaliation against the more massive tariffs this time, and that's also negative for manufacturing employment. So this policy just doesn't work as a way to increase manufacturing employment. And in fact, if you thought that manufacturing was critical to our economic health, our security, there'd be much better ways to support it than tariffs, which penalize businesses, penalize the consumer, direct subsidies of some sort or other methods.
Anna, can I add a little bit to that? If your goal is to protect, and this is very consistent with what Maury just said, if your goal is to protect jobs in a particular industry, absolutely, you can do that through tariffs. If you place tariffs on washing machines, you will have more jobs, people making washing machines. You'll then have the trade-off that you had in your question. And there was an American Economic Review, one of the top economics journals papers, that found that it was $800,000 of extra consumer costs per American worker. I don't think that is a cost that I would recommend anyone paying, but that's a trade-off. Do you want to have consumers pay $800,000 for each washing machine job? If you're talking, though, about manufacturing jobs as a whole, then everything that Maury said was correct. This is an across-the-board tariff. It's not about one particular industry. It's trying to get at all industries, and it'll have a lot of different effects. It'll raise the price of inputs. For example, if you raise the price of steel, there's far more workers in industries that use steel than industries that produce steel. It could strengthen the dollar, which will make it harder for exporters. It will take resources that are currently going for export and rechannel them into making things for the domestic market. So it will shift some manufacturing production. And then finally, the overall negative for the US economy in terms of economic growth, in terms of jobs, in terms of inflation. When things are bad for the economy, that's just not really good for any industry. It hurts everyone.
I want to amplify just 2 points. One, so maybe also a clarification, just so people don't misunderstand. When Maury was talking about manufacturing's long-term decline, that was, I think, very specifically about employment in manufacturing's long-term decline. Manufacturing has basically continued to have the same contribution to overall real output in the US economy for a long time. The way to square those two things, as Maury said, is productivity. And then this also squares the point that Jason was making, that if you boost manufacturing output in the US, you're going to probably have a trivial effect on what that does to employment. And that's because we are exceedingly productive at making stuff, at the things that we've chosen to make in the US. And so this idea that by increasing the amount of stuff we make in the US, you're going to have a resurgence in employment in manufacturing, it just doesn't square with what we know about how many people in the manufacturing sector is employing. And the other thing that I'm not sure Jason or Maury touched on is that the manufacturing sector also uses imported inputs. And tariffs, particularly across the board tariffs, are going to raise the price of those inputs. And that's actually going to make it costlier for US manufacturers. And then finally, retaliation is going to make it harder for US manufacturers to export. So there are a lot of things here that are working against the manufacturing sector, just in terms of output, and even more so against what this could possibly do for employment in the sector.
I wanted to ask you to compare the tariffs of the Biden administration to the previous Trump administration and the proposed Trump tariffs. As many people have pointed out, the Biden administration has maintained almost all of the Trump administration tariffs on China. So do you think that those have been economically harmful as well? Is there some other kind of difference between the proposed Trump tariffs and tariffs maintained by the Biden administration, or is it really just a question of scale?
I was hearing some silence, so I'll go first. I think there's, first of all, I think it's unfortunate that President Biden had criticized Trump's China tariffs before they were done and when they were done, and then kept them and even added some to them. But there's an enormous difference in terms of scale, scope, and motivation. In terms of scale, here we're talking about tariffs on $3 trillion of stuff. The China tariffs are on much, much less than that. And in fact, the Biden additions to them were only $18 billion of stuff. Second, the scale, 60% on China across the board would be a lot more than most of what the tariffs were under the Trump ones. But then I think the motivation is quite important. I am positive that it makes no sense to place tariffs on Germany, Australia, and New Zealand when they're making stuff that we don't make in the United States. There's no negotiation theory for that. There's no they're doing something unfair to us theory for that. There's no we're going to get jobs theory for that. It's really, and there's no they're going to pay those tariffs. It's really just sort of nuts. With China, there are a set of very, very difficult and complicated issues. A lot of those center around national security. Some of them center around a legitimate concern about over-reliance on China. Some of them are about unfair ways in which China has subsidized and helped its own industries. And so something is appropriate in the China sphere. Personally, I'd like to see it more focused on national security, more proportional to whatever subsidies they are, and more directed at very legitimate cases of resilience. That's not what you had with the original round of tariffs, which were on a broad set of things like consumer goods with no national security rationale whatsoever. But but I'm not positive about the answer to any question about China tariffs. I'm positive about any question. Answer to the question about Australia, New Zealand, and Germany tariffs.
Yeah, there's a tendency in the tariff debate to, when economists criticize tariffs in general, there's a tendency for proponents to pivot to, well, what about China? It's doing all these terrible things, and we need a level playing field. And as Jason says, China raises particular issues. It has long raised those particular issues for the global trading system. But a resort to across the board universal tariffs imposed on allies and competitors alike, imposed regardless of whether these are goods that we actually produce domestically or import. Like mangoes. It just makes no sense. And at some level, even if you wanted to support manufacturing, you kind of have to tariff intermediates because much domestic manufacturing is intermediates. But as we've said, that causes a huge deflationary shock. But in general, nobody thinks the tariff should apply to intermediate goods for that reason. I mean, even if you go back to Alexander Hamilton's, to just refer to the namesake of the Hamilton Project, his report on manufacturers, he's not thrilled with tariffs as a way to support new industries. He thinks it's politically the most expedient way, but he says, don't tax intermediates, don't put tariffs on intermediates. And this is sort of one of the costs of the Trump approach, which I think will be devastating for the U.S. economy.
There are two things in particular that frustrate me about the way the conversation, around these Trump tariffs, the way Trump describes them. I guess I have many things that frustrate me, but there are two things that are relevant for this conversation right now. One is tariffs are a really dumb way to try to attack trade deficits. And so tariffs, I think, should be in policymakers' toolkits for all the reasons Jason described. But I don't think Jason said in any of his reasons it's a way to actually change overall aggregate trade deficits in the US. So we are lucky enough that we borrow as a country, and lots of foreign investors really, really want to lend to us. at relatively low interest rates. And the result is that then we can consume a lot more than we save. I haven't said that quite right. But basically we are consuming more than we are than our output. And that is because the world is delighted to lend us money. And as long as that's true and our saving rates as a country are as low as they are, and our desire to consume is as great as it is, that's going to mean that we have trade deficits. We can change that around the edges by making it really expensive for ourselves to buy stuff from overseas. But that's a ridiculous way of trying to increase the amount that we're saving. And so tariffs are just a silly way of trying to affect trade deficits, which Trump invokes all the time. And yeah, I'll stop there. I've gone on too long.
No, that's
One
fine.
very last brief point I think is also important making. This isn't just economics, it's global politics. And if your goal is to restrain China's behavior, change China's behavior, placing tariffs on every country in the world is not a way to build a coalition to do that. Most countries in the world, main trading partner is China, not the United States. If they had to choose, they would choose China, not the United States. If you're serious about China, you focus on China. You don't do something across the board.
We did have a question coming in about what the costs of these tariffs might be in terms of the effect on the international trading system as well, right? You know, would this result in sort of damage to the rules-based trading system? And does that have implications for international investment? Do you want to address that one?
Well, you know, there have been issues between the US and the WTO for years, going back to the Obama administration, if not before. But the Trump administration sort of ratcheted up the disregard of global trading rules, and the Biden administration took it to a new level. This is a difficulty for the US and its relationships with allies in Europe who are trying very hard to be consistent with WTO rules and guidelines. A regime of universal tariffs would really be a grenade thrown into the system, the heart of the system. And what would be even worse is Trump's often stated goals to use the tariffs as bargaining chips with individual countries to get trade concessions, which would be totally in violation of the most favored nation principle of the WTO, and would create a very fragmented landscape for countries and for businesses throughout the world. I think the other implication, which has been less noted, and Mike Furman actually makes a good point about this in a new Foreign Affairs article, is that right now you have Europe and many countries trying to be WTO consistent, but if the US totally torpedoes the system, you really risk a free-for-all where there are no more rules, where nobody feels compelled to adhere to any sorts of norms of behavior in terms of their economic international relations. And this really does take us back to the 1930s. And that makes an environment where planning for businesses in terms of their international operations, international investment becomes very difficult. And it may well lead to the outcome that Trump seems to want for the United States, which is that all countries basically protect themselves, enhance their economic security by limiting economic relations with the rest of the world. But that's a very impoverished world.
And, Trump has said, and advocates for very high tariffs have said, yes, but look back at these historical examples when we actually did raise a lot of money through tariffs. You can't say, and the world turned. We had an economy. What's the problem? Tariffs, are a great way to raise revenue. But first, it meant significant distortions about what we made and what we consumed relative to like what we were good at making. But also that was a very different time. I mean, perhaps the 1930s is too late for what I'm about to say, but certainly when you think about like the 1800s, that was a very different time for what our capacity was for raising revenue, for the federal government to raise revenue. It was really complicated to raise revenues through something like an income tax, partly for legal reasons, but partly also it's just there was not a lot of transparency and accountability to make sure that income was being accurately, described to some sort of revenue collecting authority, and that you could really rely on making sure that people were paying their taxes as they were supposed to. Tariffs were a lot easier. You could physically see the goods coming through the ports, and there was a great deal of transparency. There's a reason that tariffs were a common way of raising revenue for governments for many hundreds of years. We have a better system now where we can actually raise revenue through a much broader tax base in a more efficient way. Using historical examples to try to explain why this is a spectacular way to raise revenue is just ignores all of the progress we've made in creating a more efficient and more transparent and broader tax base.
If I could just add to that, right now the only countries that rely on tariffs as a main source of revenue are poor developing countries that don't have the fiscal capacity to levy income taxes. Now, as Wendy said, the U.S. used to rely on tariffs for revenue back in the 19th century, the early 20th century. And, the late 19th century was the period of the robber barons, vast inequality, a populist movement in the United States that pushed back on that, a progressive movement that pushed back on that. And part of the problem was that the tariff regime was incredibly regressive. One result was that the Constitution was amended. The 16th Amendment allowed for a graduated progressive income tax, and that was felt to be more consistent with attaining an economy that was more inclusive and more equitable. And so relying on tariffs for substantial revenues would really be a move back to the 19th century system. And the amount that you could raise from tariffs, taking into account of the fact that if you tax trade, you get less trade, certainly couldn't replace the income tax, but it couldn't fund the expansive promises that Donald Trump has been making on the campaign trail, everything from eliminating taxes on Social Security to restoring the state and local income tax deduction to not taxing interest on auto loans. It just doesn't add up. It's very regressive, and you can add that to the other costs of the tariffs.
One really interesting facet of this to me has been sort of some of the unintended economic behaviors that result from the tariffs. So Wendy mentioned businesses trying to stockpile, whether warehouses will be full or empty. You also have this phenomenon of tariffs really fueling business for lobbyists and lawyers in Washington, it being very profitable for companies to try to get exemptions or exclusions to the tariffs. Do you want to talk a bit about that? What are the implications of just kind of all of these new rules and companies' efforts to dodge around them?
Yeah, the Nobel Prize in Economics this week was awarded to three economists, or three social scientists, Duran Isimoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson, for work on the importance of inclusive institutions. And they argue, I think persuasively, that a lot of what makes different countries rich and poor is the degree to which governments have rule of law, predictable rules, contracts that are enforced, and the like. I am very worried that the only thing that might be worse than across-the-board tariffs is across-the-board tariffs. And then if you're a really nice company that makes nice to the president, you don't get a tariff. And if you're a company he doesn't like, you get an even higher tariff. And you saw that with the threatened, 200%, I believe it was, tariffs on John Deere. That type of thing, Anna, as you said in your question, would lead to a lot of rent seeking, a lot of money for lobbyists. It would mean that the way to succeed as a business wasn't to invent a new product that was more appealing to consumers, that you produce better, but to get a better deal on your tariffs. It would mean other companies would be terrified of getting on the wrong side of the government because they would face a punitive tariff as a result. And that type of predictability and uncertainty is something that's very hard to build into an economic model. All of the models of tariffs we've seen are basically the sort of mechanical, what happens when the tariff happens. This adds a whole new layer, all of it a minus for the economy.
And we know that this happened in the first round of tariffs in the, in the first, with the that Trump imposed. There were, more than 100,000 requests for exemptions by U.S. steel manufacturers or users of imported steel to be exempt from having to pay those import taxes, and half of them were approved. And so that companies were paying attention to all the hurdles that they had to jump over to request these exemptions, which is just a massive waste of time when they should be doing other more productive things. And we know that a lot of them got exemptions, and that is just it's a messy, wasteful political process.
There was one audience question about how do you expect small and medium-sized businesses to cope with the sudden increase in costs due to tariffs, especially those that rely heavily on imported goods? What kind of policy measures could help them navigate these disruptions? That's a little distinct from, I think the pressures you were talking about were particularly hard for small and medium-sized businesses that didn't have a lot of Washington lobbyists and lawyers sitting around. But do you want to address this other, kind of more general question about how would small and medium-sized businesses cope?
Well, I think the best way to help them is not to levy tariffs in the first place. These businesses will have no choice but to pass on costs to consumers. And if all their competitors are in the same position, they won't be relatively disadvantaged relative to competitors, but consumers as a whole will suffer from the resulting price rises. Again, it may be that, as you say, these small and medium enterprises are really not in a position to pay the high-priced lawyers and lobby for help. So, unless some of them happen to be favored through personal connections to the administration, it's unlikely that they get relief that way. But, one of the things we learned from the last episode is that, the administration is likely to help out in various ways politically favored groups that are hurt by the tariffs. Think of Trump giving $28 billion last time around to compensate farmers for lost sales to China. I think we can expect to see more of that with across-the-board tariffs as more politically favored groups to the administration are hurt and appeal for help.
There were a few informational questions. So, I know you're economists, not trade lawyers, but you do have extensive experience in government as well. So maybe you have insight on this. If Donald Trump becomes president, would he need an act of Congress to impose an across-the-board tariff of 10%?
mean,
I'm happy to take
Georgia
that if someone
yeah,
doesn't want
please.
to. I think
Yes.
that China ones, there's almost no ambiguity in terms of his ability to do it unilaterally. The 10% across the board, he likely could do it unilaterally. He certainly has indicated, appears to have indicated that he would. And there's a lot of different statutes, including invoking national security concerns, that the courts tend to be very deferential to the president's definition and description of what constitutes a national security threat.
I mean, there would be lawsuits, but
Yes.
but presumably the tariffs would stay in place while those lawsuits made their way through the courts.
Okay.
Yeah, if I could add a little to that, in 1971, President Nixon actually did impose an import surcharge across the board, 10%, and that resulted in subsequent legislation to clarify the president's powers. And the president, as a result, has extensive powers. I mean, their legal experts disagree, but as Wendy says, Trump will impose the tariffs, and he will leave it for the legal system to work that out. And whether courts will give injunctive relief is anyone's guess. It might have to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, but there will be a period of time where those tariffs for sure stay in place. And at some level, the legal uncertainty will make things even worse as businesses try to plan for the coming quarters.
And there were a few audience questions about specific industries. People curious about whether or not possible tariffs would hurt or help manufacturers of U.S.-made solar PV panels. A question about how tariffs would affect global supply chains related to agriculture. There's another question: do you foresee there being tariffs on critical minerals, and how would that impact the U.S.-Canada trade relationship? So obviously a lot of concern from people looking at specific sectors. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or there's another question: which categories do you forecast to be hit hard by this next round of tariffs? Any thoughts on potential targets?
I mean, in general, trying to understand whether this will affect countries that we have FTAs with is one of the free trade agreements with, is one of the many mind-boggling things to contemplate. He has not talked at all about exempting them, but we have, an actual agreement with Canada and Mexico. We have, agreements with about a dozen other or more other countries that are similar to that. And by the way, those agreements also include remedial measurements that authorize basically retaliation if the rules of those agreements are broken. So it's in one sense inconceivable that it would be placed on Canada. In another sense, every single thing he said would suggest that it will be placed on them. So that relates to your discussion of critical minerals. And the like. Solar, if solar was your goal, you could focus on solar. You wouldn't need to sweep in everything, and the vast majority of what would come in under these tariffs have nothing to do with solar. But most of a lot of the solar imports are from China, so presumably they'd fall under the 60%, and the rest on the double digit. On agriculture, what you saw in the first Trump term was farmers' income before taxes was really hurt quite a lot by the tariffs. They then got big transfers from the government, and so their after tax income, if they were lucky enough to be a farmer that received those transfers, actually went up. But that went up in basically an artificial way at a tremendous cost to the government that was over and above the cost that consumers paid in terms of extra farm prices. And I don't know at this level of tariffs, by the way, I'm not even sure how much money would be needed to compensate farmers for their losses. It would be much more than can't remember what it was, 10, 20, 30 billion last time.
The challenge with figuring out exactly which goods would be, which consumer goods or consumer services, like, again, I want to reiterate that, the services sector is also going to be affected by this. The challenge was figuring out, for me, figuring out what what consumer goods are more or less affected, or what, like some are easy. I just saw a news report, or maybe it's from the Peterson. I think Peterson put out some research about, the fraction of shoes for sale as consumer goods in the US that are imported is shockingly high. So like, shoe stores are clearly going to be affected. But for things that are manufactured in the US, you might look at what the import content is, but the problem is that won't give you a sense necessarily of how critical that import content is. So like, we had a problem importing chips, semiconductor chips, in the years right after the pandemic. And it turns out it was very difficult for US manufacturers to substitute one kind of chip for another kind of chip. And this teeny tiny little thing that they couldn't get their hands on meant that they actually weren't able to sell, make and then sell a vast array of goods. And so, it might be that the imported content of some particular manufactured good in the US is really small. But if they can't substitute to something else, and if that's really critical, then disruptions in that supply chain will have enormous effects.
Yeah, that
I mean,
makes.
one.
Go ahead. You can.
I was going to add that one maybe it's an obvious follow-on from what Wendy said is that comparing across the board tariffs to the types of tariffs we've seen in the past, you can't substitute away from them by going to another foreign supplier because they're also subject to the tariff. So that makes it much more costly than even the previous round of tariffs.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering, Wendy's comments raised a question for me. What are you hearing about how businesses are kind of preparing for this possibility, if at all? Do they feel like there's anything they can do?
Frankly, I've heard a surprising level of denial. And this is just talk on the campaign trail. And by the way, it's possible. On the other hand, it's also possible that we should take seriously that when the 10% tariffs were criticized, he scaled them all the way up to 20%. And then when those were criticized, he scaled them up to maybe 50%. I'm sure there's some private preparations, but right now there's also an awful lot of private hope that this won't ever come to pass.
I think in the past couple of days, I've seen a lot more attention, taking these issues more seriously. But one thing that I think anybody trying to plan for this, in case Trump wins, one critical thing that they should keep in mind is even if Trump doesn't really mean it and it's just a negotiating tactic, and if he says, I'm going to probably impose them in March, or something like that, and not the day he becomes president, it's still going to matter for supply chains and for international trade immediately. Those effects are going to happen in advance of what may or may not be ultimately put in place, depending on what Trump really means by his plans. So they have an effect, even if they might or might not happen. Does that make sense?
There's a lot of uncertainty that's resulting from this, right?
Yeah, and anticipatory then responses
Mhm.
that are going to affect, any firm that relies on imports.
Yeah. No, I mean, in economics, everything has winners and losers. And in this case, the losers are consumers and most businesses, and the winners are reporters that cover trade for a living.
Not sure about that one, but
I mean, if you read, Robert Lighthizer book from last year, he was of course, the U.S. trade representative in the last Trump administration. He's very likely to be Secretary of Commerce, at least this time around. And he's serious about tariffs to go to Wendy's earlier point, to reduce the trade deficit, to bring back manufacturing jobs. He doesn't care much about the hit to consumption, actually. He thinks that the US should be a country of producers, not consumers, which is also a trope that you hear from the sort of populist right, and also from the Chinese Communist Party as well. That's been their approach. And so I think they're really serious. And the unfortunate thing, as Wendy said, is that the tariffs are not going to bring down the trade deficit. They're not going to restore manufacturing jobs, but it'll take several years to discover that, and a lot of pain in between.
This might be a quicker one. I had a question from a journalist colleague at another paper asking, can you ask about the timing of inflationary effects on general tariffs? What is the actual pipeline through which tariffs will affect prices, and how long does each link in the chain take to activate? Maybe that's
Could I just comment on that? I know that's more Jason's domain, but I think that this whole discussion of the effects of tariffs on inflation is a little misguided in the following sense. If you look at U.S. consumers, obviously we went through a big inflation period. But what are voters upset about? They're upset by the fact that prices are higher, right? Inflation is down. It's down closer to targets. They're not saying, "Oh, that's so great. We forgive the Biden administration." They're pissed because prices are higher, and tariffs are going to raise prices. Now that may take a few quarters or a couple of years to play out. And it may be that the Fed, has to react to that it may feed into expectations. But the basic reason why tariffs are inefficient is that we're producing stuff more expensively here that we could import more cheaply. Prices are higher, and so we don't know for sure how quickly tariffs will feed into prices. We have models that can address that question. It won't be immediate for sure, and it will be different in different industries. And that's an additional source of distortions in the economy. But the main point is that everything will be more expensive, and that's what we should care about.
I don't have anything to add to that. Somewhere between quarters and years. And, I have heard some people say, "Oh, it's not inflation, it's just the price level." Well, when the price level keeps rising and rising and rising over a 2 or 3 year period, there's a word for that, and the word is inflation. And then there's some ambiguity as to whether that is a permanent increase in the rate of inflation or not. That basically will depend on the Fed's choices, and how painful it is to prevent a permanent increase in inflation will depend on the degree to which it gets embedded or not into expectations and wage and price setting.
And Maurice, you touched on this at the very beginning, but one thing I was curious about is, why the incidence of, for example, Trump's China tariffs fell where it did. So, the ultimate cost could theoretically be borne by Chinese producers or the importer or the. But we did, in those tariffs, at least for the initial years, right? They were really borne by American consumers. Why is that? Or could you design a tariff that actually did, tax China rather than American consumers?
Well, in theory, exporters might want to lower prices that they charge to the U.S. to safeguard market share. What we saw in the sectors that were tariffed last time around is they simply did not do that. It simply didn't happen. In some cases, businesses did not pass on price increases. They took those as a hit to their profits. But the American economy as a whole didn't enjoy lower foreign prices. if we are in a position where we're seeing across the board tariffs, um, uh, it's not clear that the outcome would be exactly the same. But any sort of model that you would write down, and I've been playing around with several, indicate that there would still be a substantial effect on domestic prices. Maybe the pass through wouldn't be 100% with these across the board tariffs, but it would likely be very substantial. And again, it depends. It depends on the kind of commodities we're talking about. Commodities that are sort of differentiated commodities where the U.S. has substitutes that it produces. You might see more global price increases, but commodities that are more competitive, even though the U.S. is a large part of the world economy, it's a small fraction of the markets for those goods because the U.S. is a relatively small economy. Much of what it produces is non-traded. And so it's doubtful that, the monopoly power of the U.S. or the monopoly power on trade, as economists call it, is that great in a lot of goods.
I think it's worth noting that the point of tariffs is to raise domestic prices. So the point is that U.S. manufacturers of stuff can't compete with the cheap price of imports for the same stuff. And so they can only successfully compete if that price is higher. And so just like it's baked into why you are imposing a tariff in order to presumably try to increase manufacturing output in the US. The way that you're going to do that is by making manufacturing output in the US more profitable. And that means you are raising the prices of those things. I mean, it's baked into the point.
Mm-hmm. There were a couple questions just quickly. I'm cognizant the clock is ticking down. One asked, trade defense instruments such as anti-dumping or anti-subsidy duties are ways of protecting production against international trade distortions. Do you distinguish, make any distinction with those? And then there was another question asking, tariffs recently have been used in populist ways, i.e. to protect an industry from an attack on their business model from another country. Are there other vehicles that can be employed to exert similar pressure on other countries? So I thought that might raise some interesting questions.
Right. I mean, I think that's just both those questions are about an exceedingly different world than the across-the-board tariffs that we've been discussing. This is where, they apply to all countries, regardless of whether they're dumping or not dumping. They apply to all industries, regardless of whether or not we care about those industries. Most of the countries we're putting these tariffs on have tariffs against the United States of, numbers like 2%. I'm not sure there's any country that has average tariffs against the United States of 20%, as high as 20%. So this is just way, way, way out of proportion with any, so-called unfairness the United States is facing. There's a standard set of processes and procedures to do that. And frankly, I find those procedures overly permissive in terms of what they allow and what can be done under them. This is just something totally different.
Mm-hmm. Any final words here? Something you want to add or emphasize from our discussion in the last couple minutes?
I think it's worth taking it seriously. Again, when somebody is, as the campaign has gone on, has gotten more and more wedded to this is a tax on foreigners, this will help American industries, this is a great way to raise revenue to pay for other things, et cetera, et cetera. I would just take it very seriously. It's the one fixed point in Trump's, policy views over many, many decades. And I don't think this is the type of thing that we should, assume won't happen.
And it's a better world if it's just a negotiating tactic and it doesn't really come to pass. But even as a negotiating tactic, it matters and it will be disruptive.
Yeah, I think the sad lesson of the last Trump administration, at the aggregate level, we didn't see a huge hit to GDP. I think there may be a tendency to underestimate what would happen this time with a much broader tariff package. But I think there'll be a lot of political pressure for Trump to deliver on these promises if he's elected.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and that concludes our panel.
Thank you, Rona. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.